All right, get ready for a deep dive. One that might leave you a little disturbed. We're looking at a list from the Top 10's website. That site. Anyway, it's called Top 10 Most Evil Children in History. Now, before you think we've totally lost it and gone full true crime podcast, hold on. We're not endorsing this list as, like, the gospel truth. We're using it more as a jumping-off point to explore some real cases, the complexities of these situations. It's bound to get us thinking.
I think what's really striking about this list is that it taps into this primal fear, the idea of children committing these horrific acts. It forces us to confront some really uncomfortable truths about, human behavior, especially when it comes to younger individuals.
Definitely. And speaking of unsettling, two names jump right out at me, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the Columbine shooters. The list even breaks down the weaponry they used, like Harris had this high-point carbine rifle and Klebold a TEC DC-9. And it points to their motive as revenge against bullies.
And that's where things get even more complicated, because right after them on the list is Nikolas Cruz, the Stoneman Douglas High School shooting. The source even mentions how this shooting tragically surpassed Columbine in terms of the number of lives lost, making it the deadliest high school shooting we've seen so far.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff. Seeing those two cases side by side makes you question if bullying alone can really explain such horrific acts. The list does mention that both Harris and Cruz experienced what it calls disturbed childhoods. But that feels like an oversimplification, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, yeah. Attributing something as complex as a school shooting solely to bullying is not only inaccurate, but it's potentially dangerous. It ignores a whole bunch of factors that can contribute to violent behavior. Like, we have to consider things like mental health access to firearms, family dynamics, social isolation, and even broader cultural influences. To truly prevent future tragedies, you got to look at the whole picture. You can't just simplify it.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but only looking at one piece. And speaking of oversimplification, the list author makes a comment about Nikolas Cruz's appearance. They say, Nikolas is pretty cute, but has a horrible personality, I guess. Not all serial killers are ugly.
It brings up a really important point about the dangers of stereotypes, especially when it comes to crime. We tend to have these preconceived notions about what a dangerous person looks like, and those can be incredibly misleading, especially when we're talking about young people.
Right, appearances can be deceiving, and this actually makes me think of the case of Morgan Geyser, who's also on this list. She was involved in that Slender Man stabbing case, allegedly driven to sacrifice her friend to this, fictional internet entity.
Yeah, that case really underscores how internet culture, folklore, real-world consequences can all collide, especially for young people. It raises all these questions about the impact of online content, the allure of the macabre, and the need for better mental health awareness and support among youth.
It's a stark reminder that the internet can be a double-edged sword. Then there's the case of Jasmine Richardson, who was only 12 years old when she was alleged to have killed her parents and brother. The list author has a strong reaction to this, saying, you must be evil to kill your own family.
Cases of parricide, where a child kills a parent, are thankfully rare, but they are incredibly disturbing. They often involve this complex mix of factors like abuse, neglect, mental illness, and sometimes even this warped sense of loyalty or control. These cases also bring up difficult questions about juvenile justice. How do we hold young offenders accountable while also recognizing their developmental stage and potential for rehabilitation?
It's a balancing act for sure, especially with such serious crimes. And here's where things get even more intriguing. The list has a redacted name, just marked with, right before Paris Bemmet and Daniel Petrie. What kind of case could be so sensitive that it couldn't even be mentioned?
It's possible there are legal reasons for withholding that name, especially if the individual was a minor at the time. It also highlights the ethical considerations surrounding publicly listing minors involved in criminal activity.
Definitely makes you think about the responsibility that comes with sharing these stories. We're not just talking about abstract concepts here. We're talking about real individuals with complex backgrounds, and their cases raise profound questions about accountability, justice, and the very nature of what we consider evil.
That's exactly right. This list, with its provocative title, forces us to look beyond those single labels and grapple with the nuanced reality of these cases. And maybe that's the first step towards understanding and hopefully preventing future tragedies.
Yeah, it really does highlight the responsibility we have when we're discussing these cases. They're incredibly sensitive, incredibly complex. It's not about sensationalizing them or, passing judgment. It's about trying to understand what leads someone, especially a young person, down such a dark path. Right? It's about trying to piece together that puzzle, looking at all those factors. And that's where I think exploring some of the psychological elements could be really helpful. We keep coming back to this idea of a disturbed childhood. But what does that even really mean?
Well, it's a pretty broad term. When we talk about disturbed childhoods, we need to consider this whole spectrum of potential traumas. We're talking about things like physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, neglect, witnessing violence in the home, experiencing bullying or social isolation, or even just growing up in poverty or facing systemic discrimination.
So it's not just one type of experience, but this whole range of things that could really have a profound impact on a child's development.
Exactly. And these traumas can manifest in a variety of ways. Some children may internalize their experiences, leading to things like depression, anxiety, self-harm. Others might externalize their pain, resulting in aggression, delinquency, or even violence.
It's like this ripple effect. Early trauma can send shockwaves through a person's life, influencing their behavior and relationships for years to come.
That's a great way to put it, and it's important to remember that these experiences don't occur in a vacuum. Individual vulnerabilities interact with environmental factors, like access to weapons exposure to violence in the media, or even the influence of peer groups.
So it's like a complex equation with multiple variables contributing to the outcome.
Precisely, and that's why it's so crucial to take a multifaceted approach to prevention and intervention. We need to address those individual vulnerabilities through things like mental health support, trauma-informed care, social-emotional learning programs.
So early intervention is key.
Absolutely. The sooner we can identify and address these issues, the better the chances of preventing them from escalating into something more serious. But we also need to look at those environmental factors. How do we create safer communities? How do we limit access to weapons? How do we promote positive social norms?
It sounds like we need a whole societal shift in perspective, not just focusing on individual cases, but addressing those underlying issues that contribute to violence in the first place.
You're exactly right. It's about creating a culture of support and understanding where young people feel connected, valued, and empowered to make positive choices.
So going back to the list, are there any cases that really highlight this interplay between individual vulnerabilities and environmental factors?
Well, the Slender Man case is a particularly striking example. We have two young girls, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Ware, who were both struggling with mental health issues. They become fixated on this fictional internet creature, Slender Man, and believe that they need to kill their friend to appease him.
It's a tragic case that really highlights the power of the internet and its potential influence on, well, vulnerable minds.
It does, and it raises questions about how we navigate this digital landscape, how we distinguish between fantasy and reality online, and how we protect young people from harmful content.
It's a challenge for sure, especially with the internet evolving so rapidly.
It is, but it's a challenge we need to face head on. We need to be having open and honest conversations with young people about online safety, critical thinking, media literacy. We need to equip them with the tools to navigate the digital world responsibly and to seek help when they need it.
And it's not just about protecting them from harmful content. It's also about fostering positive online experiences, creating spaces where they can connect, learn and express themselves in healthy ways.
Exactly. The internet can be an incredible tool for learning, growth, and connection. It's about harnessing that potential while also mitigating the risks.
It's about finding that balance. And speaking of balance, I'm curious about the case of Jasmine Richardson, the 12-year-old who allegedly killed her family. It's one of the most extreme cases on the list, and it really pushes the boundaries of what we consider evil. How do we even begin to make sense of something like that?
It's definitely one of the most challenging cases to unpack, and as we discussed earlier, cases of parricide are extremely rare and often involve a complex interplay of factors. In Jasmine's case, reports suggest a history of family conflict, potential mental health issues, and possibly even the influence of her then-boyfriend who was significantly older.
So it's not just about looking at Jasmine's individual actions, but understanding the context in which those actions took place.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that the legal system recognized her young age and developmental stage. She was tried as a youth and received a sentence that focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment.
It speaks to the complexities of the juvenile justice system. How do we hold young people accountable for their actions, while also recognizing their potential for growth and change?
It's a delicate balance, and it requires a nuanced approach that considers the individual circumstances of each case. We need to move away from a purely punitive mindset and towards a more restorative model that focuses on healing, accountability, and reintegration.
It's about giving young people a chance to turn their lives around, to learn from their mistakes, and to become productive members of society.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the idea that evil isn't a fixed state. It's not something you're born with. It's a result of this complex interplay of factors, individual vulnerabilities, environmental influences, and the choices we make.
So it's not about labeling someone as evil, but about understanding the forces that shape their behavior and working to address those root causes.
That's the key. It's about shifting our focus from judgment to understanding, from punishment to prevention. And that requires a willingness to look beyond the surface, to delve into the complexities of human behavior, and to recognize the potential for change that exists within each of us.
It's about seeing the humanity in everyone, even in those who have committed horrific acts.
Exactly. And that's where true hope lies, in the belief that even in the darkest of circumstances, there's always the possibility of redemption, of healing, and of moving towards a more just and compassionate world.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that even when things seem really dark, there's always that glimmer of hope. But going back to that list of most evil children in history, it really makes you think about how we define evil to begin with.
Right. Is it like this inherent thing, something you're just born with? Or is it more a product of your experiences, the environment you grew up in, the trauma you faced, maybe?
The lid itself seems to lean toward that whole born evil idea, just based on the title alone. But after really digging into these cases, it's hard to ignore all those outside factors, those cracks in the system that could have contributed.
I think it's so important to approach this topic with nuance, with empathy. It's easy to just throw that label evil on someone and kind of distance ourselves from their actions. But if we do that, we're not really understanding the roots of violence, and we can't work toward any real solutions.
And it also dehumanizes the individuals involved, both the perpetrators and the victims.
Absolutely. And that can be a dangerous path. When we dehumanize others, it becomes way too easy to justify violence and oppression. We lose sight of our shared humanity.
So, big picture here, what are the takeaways? What do we want our listeners to walk away with after this deep dive?
I think the most important thing is to encourage critical thinking. Don't just accept simple explanations or labels. Question your own assumptions, your own biases. Be open to different perspectives. And above all, remember that even in those really dark cases, there's always hope for understanding, for healing, for change.
That's a powerful message. And it's a good reminder that this conversation, it doesn't end here. We've only scratched the surface of a really complex issue. It's up to all of us to keep exploring these topics, to have those tough conversations, and to work towards a future where these kinds of tragedies become less and less frequent.
Well said. The work's far from over. But I do believe that through understanding, empathy, and a commitment to positive change, we can create a world where every child has the opportunity to reach their full potential, free from that shadow of violence and despair.
And on that note, we'll leave you with one final thought to ponder. If evil isn't this fixed trait, but rather a consequence of circumstance, what does that say about our responsibility to create a more just and equitable world? What can we do individually and collectively to break that cycle of violence and foster a society where all children have the chance to thrive? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.